Hey everybody, Trey here. Welcome back to another forecast discussion. The SPC has upgraded to a moderate risk level 4 out of 5 across parts of Kansas, southwest Kansas into the central and east central portion of the state. You see in the red shaded region here. That is the upgrade to a moderate risk, once again, level 4 out of 5. So this is a very serious severe weather setup on tap for today, and it is going to be a potent one. Enhanced risk surrounds that, extending up into northern Kansas down into northwest Oklahoma, and a large slight risk surrounding that and extending up into the northern plains, western Nebraska, South Dakota, far southern North Dakota. So we do have a severe threat that does extend all the way up there, but again, our main severe threat going to be down in the orange and specifically the red shaded region here, which is where the moderate risk is located. All hazards on the table for today, but the main threat, as we discussed in yesterday's video, is going to be significant damaging winds. We have a now 45% hatched area for significant damaging winds there within the moderate risk. So southwest Kansas, places like Garden City, Dodge City, eastward toward Pratt, Greensburg, Great Bend up to the north there over toward Wichita, and just south of the I-70 corridor there in north central Kansas. You are under the gun for the greatest threat for significant severe wind gusts, and we'll go through some of the reasons why that is the case today, but we are expecting a convective complex that could produce significant, very damaging straight line wind gusts in today's setup. Large to very large hail is also going to be a threat today. We do have that 30% hatched area for large to significant hail, perhaps 2 to 3 plus inches in diameter hailstones today, specifically within that red stippled region here. So up toward north central Kansas, southward into northwest Oklahoma. Again, Dodge City, areas off to the east, Greensburg, Pratt, Great Bend, under the gun for that severe weather threat, that severe hail threat today, and down into northwest Oklahoma, places like Woodward in that 30% hatched risk area for significant severe hail. There is a tornado threat today. It is at a 5% across parts of from northeast Kansas down into northwest Oklahoma, so we could see a few tornadoes today, but again, the main threats are going to be significant damaging winds and significant severe hail. But a tornado or two is possible, particularly with any more discrete convection in this particular environment. So without further ado, now that the risk areas have been identified, let's go ahead and get started. For today's video, we're only going to focus on the setup today because it is so potent. So we will be back at a later time with videos on the upcoming days with this severe weather outbreak sequence. If you want to hear my initial thoughts on the upcoming days in this sequence, go ahead and take a look at yesterday's video. I'll put a link to that in the description box below. So let's go ahead and get started. First, let's take a look at what's going on right now. We do have a complex of thunderstorms moving across southern Nebraska and northern Kansas. That will continue to move off to the east-northeast as we go into the late morning and early afternoon hours today. So it shouldn't have too much of an issue on destabilization in this area for the afternoon, although it might have some. But our main areas for full destabilization will be back to the west and northwest of this complex, across western Nebraska into the Dakotas, and to the south of this complex where our main risk area is in this setup. So not expecting too much of an issue with these storms as far as degrading the environment for later on, but we certainly will have our main threat away from this area of convection later on this afternoon. As we go to our SPC mesoanalysis page, this is what our 500 millibar pattern looks like at the moment. We have a little bit of a shortwave here across Nebraska into Kansas that is likely convectively induced or convectively enhanced there, as that is coincident with our ongoing convection across that area. But our main shortwave in this setup is going to be back here, currently situated across the Four Corners region down into the Arizona-New Mexico border region. A little bit of stronger flow associated with that jet streak there, 40 to 45 knots or so of flow. That will continue to move off to the northeast going into the afternoon, and that will be our initiating mechanism, at least on the synoptic scale, for severe weather in today's setup. Now, again, we haven't, as we talked about yesterday, we haven't had a robust mid and upper level response, so our low level response has been muted up to this point as well. Here is our surface map. You can see here we do have a surface low center developing across Wyoming here. That is because we have had stronger flow aloft, and the strongest flow aloft traversing the Rockies in this area. You can see on our 500 millibar map, that is where our main trough is situated, up there across Idaho into Montana and Wyoming. So that is where our strongest low level response has taken place. As this little shortwave down here to the south makes its way across the Rockies today, we should see at least some surface low development here across southern portions of the high plains. You can already start to see a broad cyclonic signature there in the flow across eastern New Mexico into west Texas. So that will probably intensify at least slightly going into the afternoon, helping to back and strengthen those winds in the low levels for today's setup. So not a tightly wound surface low here by any means, but certainly enough cyclonic flow there at the surface to give us our main sort of boundaries and mechanisms for severe weather, as we would see in a much stronger setup that we've seen, in the past this season. Up at 850 millibars, our low-level jet. We do have a nice plume of low-level jet here across the region from the Dakotas southward into Texas. 30 to 35, 40 knots or so of flow there across the plains, with the strongest flow up here across northern portions of the risk area there, ahead of the stronger surface low and low-level cyclone center there across Wyoming into southern Montana. So a little bit stronger flow up there. Not quite a strong flow down here across the southern plains. We should see at least some semblance of the low-level jet maintaining itself through the day, although we will see it start to really ramp up as we go toward and after sunset in today's setup. We'll take a look at some model data for that in just a second. So that's what's going on here in the upper atmosphere. Let's take a look now at the surface, our raw surface data here. So I'll refresh this here, and you can see where our juiciest air mass is right now. Our 60s dew points are slowly migrating up into southern Kansas, across the Texas Panhandle, eastward into Oklahoma. That's where our main area for our most robust moisture is at the moment, extending off into East Kansas as well, down into Missouri and the areas southward. 70s dew points located along the Red River there. You see Ardmore 77 over 70, Duncan, Oklahoma 80 over 71. So our most robust moisture there, certainly located across North Texas into southern Oklahoma. That will continue to make its way northward as well. Do expect some impacts from vertical mixing today, so don't expect those dew points to really maintain themselves at that level through the afternoon, as we are pretty fully clear across these areas south of the convective complex in Kansas and Nebraska, as you see there. To the south of that, very clear skies here, just some scattered cumulus there across southern Kansas, but in Oklahoma, perfectly clear skies there across the region, across that region at the moment, and that will continue into the afternoon. So would expect strong surface heating, temperatures probably getting up into the upper 80s to low 90s today. We'll talk about some impacts of that in just a second as we look at some model data. But I do expect vertical mixing to be an issue today, and so we probably will see these dew points decrease at least a little bit going into the afternoon, maybe into the low to mid 60s at best across this area. Moisture farther to the north, of course, not going to be quite as robust. Just simply takes more time to get this moisture up here into these areas. But we do have that surface low developing across Wyoming into Montana, helping to strengthen and back those winds at the surface. So we should see at least some attempt to get more robust moisture northward into Kansas and Nebraska, although the greatest moisture will probably lie to the south here across western Oklahoma. Still robust moisture here across Kansas to fuel a significant severe threat there. Shouldn't have a problem getting these upper 60s dew points into the region. Again, some mixing probably this afternoon, so low to mid 60s dew points probably the likely scenario here across southern Kansas in the moderate risk area. Trying to pick out some of our boundaries here, a little bit difficult at this point. We do see a little bit of a circulation, again, down here across this eastern New Mexico, western Texas Panhandle region. So developing surface low in that area. You can see the cyclonic flow around that center there, just to the northwest of Hereford, Texas, which is right there. So somewhat of a surface low there. Dry line starting to develop as well, kind of a diffuse dry line at this point, somewhere across the eastern New Mexico, West Texas vicinity. Your better moisture here off to the east for sure. That will probably mix eastward a little bit today into western Kansas and near the Texas-Oklahoma border region to set up for this afternoon. So surface low somewhat in here, warm frontal zone probably somewhere in here. Looking at just the overall wind shift, it's a little bit difficult to pick out where our actual boundaries are here, but it looks like this is a decent guess. We do have a temperature gradient here, 70s across southern Kansas, 60s to the north, and a moisture gradient for sure. 60s dew points down here across southern Kansas with low to mid 50s dew points up here to the north. So our warm front somewhere in this vicinity here, that will continue to advect northward through the day, most likely as we get that northward advance of the moist sector there into Kansas and Nebraska and areas to the north. So that's our surface pattern here. Let's take a look at some soundings from this morning. This is the 12Z Norman, Oklahoma sounding. We do have some semblance of moisture there at the surface, a moist layer extending up to about 850 millibars or so. Not the most ideal look here for a severe weather setup. We do have quite a bit of dry air here in the low to mid levels of the atmosphere. Very, very, very steep lapse rates here aloft, up above 800 millibars or so, up to about 500 millibars. That is our elevated mixed layer. We always talk about it here on the channel. That's that layer of warm, dry, well-mixed air that emanates from the higher terrain out west, gets transported out to the east on the southwesterly mid-level flow, and that allows a cap to remain on the atmosphere for the day and a lot of drier air to work its way in. Now, this can sometimes be a double-edged sword. While it can allow for a cap to keep the environment unsullied from convection throughout the day, at least from a storm chasing perspective, of course, it can allow a lot of dry air to seep in. And we do see a ton of dry air seeping in here, especially above 850 millibars. So very dry air here. We also see quite a bit of dry air here aloft above 500 millibars as well. So a fairly dry profile. And this is one factor that is going to lead to the significant severe wind threat with today's convection. Lots of dry air in the environment getting entrained into these storms. And that is going to allow for evaporative cooling of downdrafts. And as those downdrafts evaporate a little bit, the winds in those downdrafts tend to accelerate. So we're going to get strong winds from evaporative cooling of these downdrafts making their way to the surface, helping to add to the outflow production in these storms and add to the overall strength of the winds at the surface. So that is one factor into the significant severe wind threat for today. We'll talk about some other factors here in just a second. But overall, we do have plenty of instability already, over 1,400 joules per kilogram mixed layer CAPE at this point. It is elevated instability, and given such a strong cap, we should see that cap maintain itself into mid to late afternoon before storms develop and that shortwave finally does move in, allowing for some forcing for ascent and some erosion of that cap. Again, we should have quite a bit of surface heating to deal with today, so temperature is going to be up into the upper 80s to low 90s today, also helping to erode that cap. Convective temperature today, 95 degrees, so that should be easily maintained. Even if we don't get to 95 degrees and we get to maybe the low 90s, with that shortwave coming in, that should allow for the extra compensation needed to breach the cap fully and allow for surface-based supercells to develop across the region. So that's what's going on there in Oklahoma City today, or Norman today. Dodge City, not much to speak of here yet. We're still well north of the warm sector here at this point at 12Z at Dodge City. Elevated instability though for sure. And down at Fort Worth, much of the same. Lots of drier air here aloft, going to help fuel some stronger downdrafts. We also see here a little bit of stronger flow aloft, and especially as that shortwave trough makes its way in, we will have stronger mid-level flow across this region developing. And that mid-level flow through downdrafts can get transported to the surface. It's called momentum transfer, downward momentum transfer. So if we get that downward momentum transfer through downdrafts from that, you'll get just simply this stronger mid-level flow to get down to the surface via downdrafts. That will also add to the significant severe wind threat. As we talked about, the outflow production in these storms will be quite high, given high temperature dew point spreads and very dry air aloft. And so that, coupled with some stronger flow getting transported down to the surface through downdrafts, that is going to allow for significant severe wind gusts, perhaps 70, 80, 90 plus mile-an-hour winds with the convective complex expected this evening, especially across Kansas. So that is why the wind threat is going to be the main threat with today's setup. Plenty of outflow being produced by these storms and stronger winds aloft transported down to the surface. And that will continue for quite a while, and we should quite a while into the evening and overnight hours for a long duration, significant severe wind threat in this setup. So let's go ahead and take a look at some model data here. This is the 12Z NAM. At 500 millibars, as we always start off with. Initialized pretty well here. Here's our convectively enhanced shortwave over Kansas and Nebraska, and our main shortwave back in here across the Four Corners region. A little bit of a stronger jet streak associated with that shortwave, going to be rotating through the flow and making its way into the Central Plains by mid-afternoon today. Here we are at 4 p.m., that shortwave nicely there in eastern Colorado to western Kansas, and that will help initiate storms with strong surface heating, helping to breach the cap there by mid-afternoon or so across these areas of Kansas and down into northwest Oklahoma especially. Up here to the north, we do have a little bit of influence from that northern trough there, so that will help on the synoptic scale up there in areas across western Nebraska, northward into the Dakotas to fuel that severe threat there. But again, our main severe threat associated with this southern shortwave moving from the Four Corners region into the Central Plains today. So this is at 4 p.m. going into the evening hours. That shortwave continues off to the east, likely will be convectively enhanced as well as we get that strong convective complex to take shape. But that shortwave will be our main player for today's severe threat across the central and southern plains. Going down to the surface, let's take a look at the surface here. So this is our surface map. initialized this morning pretty well. A little bit of a surface low center developing there across Wyoming. Broad cyclonic flow, fairly weak cyclonic flow there across the southern high plains. Going into the afternoon hours, we see that change just a little bit. Nice, strong surface low center there across Wyoming into South Dakota, right in there. And we do see a little bit of a strengthening of the surface low down here to the south. So a couple of different centers within the broader cyclonic flow at the surface. So that should help, again, strengthen and back those winds at the surface, leading to stronger deep layer shear for supercells here this afternoon. Now, one thing that is going to be a problem today, at least from a tornado perspective, is going to be the temperature dew point spreads. You can see here on the NAM, which, as we know, the NAM has that typical cool bias with surface temperatures. Surface temperatures tend to be a lot cooler than what they should be. And you can see here, even the NAM getting temperatures up into the upper 80s to low 90s across this area. So if we expect some mixing of the dew points down into the, let's say at best case scenario, we'll see mid, maybe slightly upper 60s dew points. So maybe a dew point of maybe 66. If we have temperatures into the low 90s, we'll say 92, 93. That's 93 over 66. That is a 27 degree temperature dew point spread. And again, that is estimated. But even the NAM here showing warm surface temperatures with dew points probably in the mid 60s or so. That's going to lead to very high temperature dew point spreads at the surface. As we know, high temperature dew point spreads are quite unfavorable for tornadic activity because as we have a drier subcloud layer, the area below the cloud base, if that layer is dry, which we're seeing here on some of our model data, that is going to be difficult to overcome for any tornadic circulations. Because that tends to produce stronger outflow. So you have a lot of dry air in the atmosphere today, dry air aloft in the low and upper levels, and dry air here at the surface. That is going to really fuel strong outflow from these storms from the get-go. We're not going to be able to, and oftentimes when you have these high temperature dew point spreads from the get-go and strong outflow production from the get-go, it's tough for those storms to recover even into the evening. By that point, when the temperature dew point spreads come down towards sunset, you have already either a storm mode that is unfavorable given congealing outflows, or those storms just can't really recover. So it looks like we will see pretty strong outflow from these storms from the get-go, and that should keep the tornado threat on the very low side for today, I think. That will allow for a lot of outflow. A lot of storms that will occur will produce outflow, and those outflows will congeal, and you'll get a strong linear segment to move off to the east going into the evening hours after those outflows have congealed fully. So that's at 4 p.m. Here we are at 7 p.m. Still temperatures up in the low to mid 80s. So temperature dew point spreads do try to come down a little bit. So any more discrete supercells, especially on the southern flank of the convective complex in Kansas, there in northwest Oklahoma, would have the greatest threat for any tornado threat there with temperature dew point spreads coming down. But again, I think we will be fairly outflow dominant from the get-go, and eventually any activity here in northwest Oklahoma will merge with the ongoing complex there in Kansas. So let's go ahead and take a look at our moisture for today. I'll start off here in our southern plains sector just so we can get an idea of the moisture transport here. So at 12Z this morning, this is how the moisture field was initialized at the surface. Northern edge of the 60s dew points up here across southern Kansas. Dry line developing out there across the Texas Panhandle region. Again, somewhat of a diffuse dry line at this point, not a really tight one, but still a dry line nonetheless, with your 70s dew points slowly creeping their way northward into the Red River region by morning. So 70s dew points making their way up there into southern Kansas. You can see where our storms fire. Those dew points off to the west. There in western Kansas, dew points in the low 60s even just ahead of the dry line. So that is going to further increase those temperature dew point spreads with temperatures up into the 90s there, 92, 93 degrees over. Here we have 62, 63 degrees. So that's a 30 degree temperature dew point spread. And that is why we're going to see quick outflow dominance from any storms that fire there in western Kansas and eventually a congealing of those strong outflows. Down into the northwest Oklahoma, we do have that those 70s dew points making their way up to southern Kansas there by 21Z, 4 p.m. But again, those storms are going to fire back out to the west, where dew points are a little bit lower, and I would suspect some vertical mixing taking place today to lower those dew points even further. So that is going to be an issue with any convection here today. I do not expect there to be a robust tornado threat with these storms because the moisture is going to be on the low side, especially in the low levels. As we go into the evening, we do see some semblance of those stronger dew points making their way out into the area where the storms will be, but by that point, I do think we will see a pretty quick congealing of everything into a full line there, and any discrete supercells will probably be absorbed into the southern end of the line, and then we'll have to watch that for mostly a hail and wind threat on the southern end and a significant damaging wind threat to the north across the main convective complex. Initial supercells should be fairly discrete in nature. We'll go back to our dry line there, and we'll put on the cape there with our shear vector. So here's our dry line there, and you can see that our shear vectors are very much perpendicular to the initiating boundary there, the dry line. So that should allow for fairly discrete supercells initially, but even though we don't have strong forcing today with a fairly subtle shortwave and good shear vector orientation with respect to the initiating boundary, storm mode should quickly become more linear in nature because of the strong outflow production with these storms. Again, storms are going to go up, immediately produce strong outflow, and even if they will be discrete in the first place, they will tend to have strong outflows that will eventually converge and congeal into one, and we'll see storm initiation and propagation along those congealing outflows into one linear complex fairly quickly, I think, in this setup. Maybe a couple hour window for discrete supercells, but after that, it will be a quick transition to a more of a squall line there. Down in northwest Oklahoma, forcing a little bit weaker, capping a little bit stronger. So I would suspect the mode to be a little bit more discrete for longer down there across northwest Oklahoma. But again, eventually things will congeal into a line with that significant damaging wind threat. So let's take a look at some soundings here from across the region. So we'll take a look here. One across, so this will be at 4 p.m. Central Daylight Time. Let's take a look at a sounding here from western Kansas, just north of the Garden City, Dodge City area there. Again, this is at 4 p.m. Then we'll take one here at Woodward, Oklahoma. So here we are, western Kansas by 4 p.m., and that is basically all of the stuff we were talking about. We're going to be fairly strongly unstable today, 4,000 joules per kilogram or so, mixed layer cape there, plenty of instability throughout the atmosphere. But again, fairly dry air in the mid-levels of the atmosphere, helping to evaporatively cool those downdrafts within those thunderstorms, and our low-level profile there. Fairly strong inverted V signature there in the low levels of the atmosphere. 86 over 64 here, as we talked about. The temperature is probably going to be higher than that, up into the low 90s, and dew points could be a little bit lower than that if vertical mixing does take place. So again, you're looking at a temperature dew point spread in that 25 to 30 degree range there. Not all that favorable for tornadic activity. So large hail going to be a threat within the initial life cycle of these supercells with strong instability, strong steep lapse rates aloft, near the freezing level, strong instability right around that freezing level there, that 0 degrees Celsius level, and so that will allow for large hail with weak low-level shear. Low-level shear definitely on the weaker side here, fairly unidirectional flow in the lowest kilometer or so of the atmosphere, favoring weak low-level shear, strong instability. That is a classic combo for large to very large hail in these supercells. Strong enough deep layer shear, though, for supercells. 30 knots of effective bulk shear. That is on the margins, but I do think we will see supercells in this environment. Perhaps a mix of multicells and supercells, but we will see supercells making their way across Kansas here initially with that large hail and damaging wind threat. Then we go to northwest Oklahoma. Here, the NAM is depicting a lot drier air here across this region. 93 over 64 there at the surface, so very high temperature dew point spread. So your inverted V profiles there in the lowest kilometer or so of the atmosphere, leading to strong outflow production in these storms, and a ton of dry air aloft there above 850 millibars. So that will also help to evaporatively cool those downdrafts, So this is why I've seen a lot of talk about northwest Oklahoma being the spot today, and certainly if I was chasing today, which unfortunately I'm not due to our Tour 5 group beginning this evening, but because if I was chasing today, I would be up there in northwest Oklahoma given a more discrete storm mode, but I don't think the tornado threat is all that high today given such dry air there in the low to mid levels of the atmosphere, helping to produce very strong outflow even with those discrete supercells that fire in northwest Oklahoma. We do have strong enough deep layer shear for supercells though, weak low level shear, strong instability, favorable for that large to very large hail threat and damaging wind threat with those storms. So that's at 4 p.m. Let's go to 7 p.m. So by this point, we will have outflow conglomeration here across western Kansas into more of a clustered linear mode there. So we'll take a sounding out ahead of what should be a developing MCS. And then down here in northwest Oklahoma, once again, we'll take a sounding there. So here we are at 0Z up there in western Kansas. Temperature dew point spreads stay pretty high there. We do have dew points up in toward the upper 60s there across that region, 87 over 68 by 7 p.m. Probably temperatures will start to be coming down a little bit by this point, so temperature dew point spreads might start to come down to that range where tornadic activity is possible, but again, storm mode is probably going to thwart any robust tornado threat given the quick conglomeration of those outflows into more of a linear segment. Still very strong instability, 4,500 joules per kilogram mixed layer CAPE on this particular sounding, so plenty of instability to support very robust severe weather. This is a fairly good looking hodograph for some structure, and especially down into northwest Oklahoma. We'll take a look at that in a second. But strong deep layer shear to support organized convection. Still limited low-level shear there. Fairly unidirectional flow once again in the low levels there. So all in all, storm mode, fairly weak low-level shear, going to maintain mostly that damaging wind threat as we go into the evening hours there. Down to the south, this is where things could get interesting and could be a little bit of a structure play. Fairly dry mid and low levels here. Those temperature dew point spreads remain fairly high. So again, I don't think tornadic activity is really on the table for today so much. But drier air, that tends to, again, favor that outflow. So damaging winds, large hail going to be the main threat with any convection in northwest Oklahoma, as it will be a little bit more discrete. Still strong instability, but this is a pretty classic combination for pretty epic structure. When you have a little bit of convective inhibition remaining and you can get a storm to go on the dry line, and you have a lot of dry air aloft, that tends to sculpt out these storms. And we have fairly strong, fairly decent streamwise vorticity here in the low levels of the atmosphere. So that will allow, perhaps force some of that pancake stack type structure. And again, with that drier air, that could sculpt out those storms and really make for a nice structure show there in northwest Oklahoma before the line kind of eats up the discrete activity in northwest Oklahoma. So chasers going out today, definitely pay attention to the structure today. Again, I think the tornado threat is very, very low up in these areas today, given that dry air there in the low levels. But I would suspect that if a storm goes, it could have some pretty decent structure. Might tend to be a little bit more on the LP side, the low precipitation side, given drier air there aloft and some capping. So you might get one or two storms to go at most there in northwest Oklahoma, but it could be a nice show, a nice low precipitation barber pole type structure with some pancake stacks there before the line eats it up there to create before we get full MCS development there into the overnight hours. So pretty nice chase opportunity here in northwest Oklahoma today for a nicely structured supercell. Again, I don't think the tornado threat is all that high for the reasons previously stated, but could be a nice chase nonetheless. And then eventually the squall line will take shape, full MCS moving eastward across Kansas with that significant damaging wind threat. So let's take a look at some convection allowing model data today. And so this is the 12Z HRRR run. It's initialized those storms across Kansas and Nebraska this morning fairly well. Those move off pretty quickly to the northeast, and behind that we're left with nice destabilization here. And we get initial development there in southeast Colorado by pretty early in the afternoon, 19Z, a little bit higher terrain, that's about 2 p.m. So a little bit higher terrain helping to initiate those storms early on in southeast Colorado. Then they move off into, and you can see right away, pretty quick transition to a more linear clustered mode, given fairly strong outflow production in those storms. The HRRR does have a nice discrete supercell down here in northwest Oklahoma. That, again, will have a longer window to remain discrete than areas farther to the north where there will be quite a significant transition to a more linear clustered mode. But eventually, everything will kind of congeal into one, and we'll have this squall line moving east across Kansas into the post-sunset hours tonight with that significant damaging wind threat. So that is the HRRR here. That convection continues into tomorrow morning across Kansas. And then we see, we'll take a look at another model here, the WRF ARW model. So there's that convection off to the north, initial convective development there early on this afternoon across eastern Colorado. And again, any convection that fires, pretty quick transition to more of a line segment there, full on line there within the first couple hours of development. Some more isolated development once again down there in northwest Oklahoma. That will be the favorite area for any more discrete convection, discrete supercells, but a full-on squall line there. You can see all those outflows propagating out ahead of it. Those will come with that very significant damaging wind threat as it moves off to the east into Kansas going into this evening. NSSL WRF model. Let's take a look at the NSSL WRF here. Same thing. Pretty pretty much on the same page as the other models. We do see initial development up here along the warm front. Didn't really cover that in this video. The warm front will be moving slightly northward through the day. If any supercells can develop early on along the warm front, they could foster that all hazards threat with a little bit better moisture pooling along the front and a little bit stronger low-level shear along the actual frontal zone. So we'll have to watch that for sure. Didn't talk about that a lot in this video, but that area, we've seen a couple cams now. Cam Solutions have that activity early on in the afternoon there along the warm front, so that'll have to be watched for sure. But I think we'll still see a tendency for outflow production in those storms and anything out to the west. Quick transition to more of a line up here, western Nebraska all the way down into Kansas. Not much discrete activity showing up here across northwest Oklahoma. Maybe a little bit of an attempt there on the southern end of the line there along the Kansas-Oklahoma border. But again, this very quick transition to a full-on squall line by about sunset with that significant outflow and damaging wind potential along it. So that is those are our cam solutions here. We talked about the conditionality of the setup here. Farther south you go into northwest Oklahoma, looking fairly less conditional here. This is the SBC HREF, so our high-resolution ensemble forecast system. So it basically takes all the cams, the convection-allowing models, and treats them as an ensemble. So you're not looking at one or two individual models. You're looking at all of them as a whole. And this is our probability for updraft helicity greater than 100. Basically. So this is basically going to show you where your updraft helicity streaks are among all of the models as an ensemble, and it gives you a probability of that being greater than 100, which is certainly favorable for updraft rotation and tornadic, and possibly not tornadic, but mostly significant supercells. And you can see here that we do have that 70% contour. This is by about 1Z. Your 70% contour does stretch down here into northwest Oklahoma. Here's your 50% contour. So it is looking more likely than a coin flip for sure that we will see storm development down here in northwest Oklahoma. A couple models are showing some development farther south, but it is much more conditional, only that 10 to 30% probability down there for western Oklahoma. But up here in northwest Oklahoma, looking a lot less conditional than it was before, and that is going to be your favored location for any discrete supercell activity with that large hail and damaging wind threat before things congeal into more of a line there across Kansas and far northern Oklahoma this evening. So looking a little bit less conditional there in northwest Oklahoma. The farther south you go, much more conditional, and don't expect much in the way of convective development down there in western and southwest Oklahoma, northwest Texas, given very weak forcing and stronger capping with southern extent. So that's going to wrap things up for this video. Again, a very interesting, potentially potent day on tap for parts of the Central Plains. Again, moderate risk upgrade has been issued by the SPC there from southwest Kansas into the east central part of the state. Places like Garden City, Dodge City, Greensburg, Pratt, over toward Wichita, up toward Great Bend, and approaching the I-70 corridor there in north central Kansas, under the gun for that level 4 out of 5 threat today, going into the evening hours. Enhanced risk in the orange area surrounding that down into northwest Oklahoma to cover that possible discrete supercell threat down there. And then the large slight risk surrounding that and going up into the northern plains, western Nebraska into the Dakotas. Again, all hazards are on the table, but significant damaging wind likely to be the main factor in today's setup, as we'll have quick transition to outflow dominance from these supercells and morphing them in as those outflows congeal into a solid squall line this evening with that robust damaging wind potential, 70, 80, 90 plus mile an hour winds. Given that strong, that ample dry air aloft and in the low levels, as well as downward momentum transport through downdrafts from within the downdrafts of these storms. So a robust squall line likely to develop here across southern Kansas, especially going into the evening hours, which will foster that significant damaging wind threat there, especially in the pink stippled area. Large to very large hail also going to be a threat in the initial development of the supercells today, especially within the yellow and red stippled areas there. Large to very large hail, 2 to 3 plus inch in diameter hailstones possible with the initial supercells, and then the damaging wind threat takes over as the storm mode degrades into more of a line. Tornado threat is there today at a 5%. Again, I don't believe there to be a very high tornado threat today, given the very high cloud bases, very high LCLs today. Strong high temperature dew point spreads there at the surface and ample dry air aloft should thwart any robust tornado threat with this activity. And the damaging wind threat going to be the main threat with these storms. So all in all, a very potent day today. Definitely be sure to keep your weather radios handy if you live in any of these areas, but especially the orange and particularly the red shaded regions today. They're across southern Kansas. It does look to be a very potent setup going into the evening. And even though they're going to be likely straight line winds, they still can be very, very damaging. So take any warnings seriously as they pop up in your area. So without further ado, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.